Hi, and welcome to Resin Chem Tech. This is part 3 in a multi-part series on building an 80s styles coin-operated retro arcade machine. You can find links to the previous parts of this series down in the video description, but in part 3, I'm going to focus on the bezel, monitor mounting, the marquee area, and a little bit about the plexiglass. So let's get started. So at the end of part 2, the primary part of the cabinet was built and it was up on its feet. However, I really hadn't covered building out of the bezel area, the monitor and monitor mounting, and building out of the marquee area. So that's what this part's going to be about. I'll also talk a little bit at the end about some of my struggles with plexiglass. Now in part 1, where I talked about the design and some of the parts, the one thing I really didn't talk about was the monitor. But the selection of the monitor was also going to be important to the design because the monitor, along with the control board, was going to determine the overall width of the cabinet. Now, up to this point, I've been doing all of my testing using a 32-inch, I believe it was a Samsung LCD TV, and things looked pretty good. So that's initially what I thought I was going to use. But as I designed things, a 32-inch TV, the width was going to be really, really tight, or I was going to have to bump out the cabinet and make it wider than I wanted to. So I opted to drop back and start looking at 27-inch displays. I had a few other requirements that I really wanted in this display if I could find them. One, I wanted any kind of power buttons or control buttons for this system to be on the back side of the monitor, not along the side or along the front where it would get in the way of the bezel and I would not be able to get to those buttons if I need to. Next, it needed to have audio out. This is because, and I don't know if it's improved or not, but back at the time, the headphone jack on a Raspberry Pi, the audio was horrible. It was really scratchy. So the idea was to feed my signal, video and audio via HDMI to the display, then come out of the headphone or audio out of the display into an amplifier to drive the speakers for the system. And the final requirement, which was a bonus, was that the monitor would power on when power was applied and you wouldn't have to actually push the power button or use a remote to turn the monitor on. So I started doing some looking around, ran down to my local Best Buy, and actually found a 27-inch, I believe it was a Panasonic LCD TV that had all the requirements. It had the controls on the back, it had a headphone jack, so I bought it, brought it home, hooked it up to the Raspberry Pi, and it was awful. The resolution was horrible. No matter what adjustments I tried to make to it, things were blurry, weren't sharp images. It definitely was not going to work. So back in the box it went and back to Best Buy. So I expanded my search to start looking at 27-inch computer monitors, specifically gaming monitors. That's when I ran across this BenQ. So for those that are interested, this is actually a BenQ 27-inch model GL2760H. Now don't go trying to look that up. This was over 4 years ago and that model has been retired. But it had everything that I wanted. It had the control buttons on the back. It had an audio or headphone jack out. It was a 1920 by 1080 display with a 2 millisecond response time, and the width was right at 25¼ inches, which was perfect for my cabinet. As an added bonus, it was in stock at my local Fry's Electronics. Rest in peace, Fry's, we will miss you. So I ran off, picked up that monitor, brought it home, hooked it up, and it was beautiful. And it did have the ability to turn on automatically when it received power and received an HDMI signal. So with that, I had everything that I needed to start building the bezel. If you recall in part 1, when I was talking about the design of the cabinet, I wanted to be able to easily replace the plexiglass if it becomes damaged or scratched, the ability to actually replace the monitor should it go bad and need to be upgraded, and the ability to replace the plexiglass and even the graphics in the marquee area. So for the bezel, this is the initial design that I came up with. By the way, there will be copies of all of these drawings available in a GitHub repo, and I will post a link to that down in the video description. But the bezel itself was just built out of some of the 1/2-inch MDF board, and the 3 bottom pieces were actually glued together and a bracket was just added for support, but the top actually wasn't glued on. It's just held on by a bracket. The entire bezel is mounted in the cabinet with these mounting blocks and some angle brackets. That means if I needed to replace the plexiglass, I could remove the 4 screws on the mounting blocks. The entire bezel would come out from the front. I would remove these 2 brackets, the top would lift off, and I could slide the plexiglass out and slide a new piece in. Now you might be asking, why do you even want plexiglass? Well, for one, it looks quite a bit more authentic, like a real arcade cabinet, which would tend to have a plexiglass front. But more importantly, it keeps sticky little fingers off of your display from the kids nowadays who think everything is a touchscreen. So to make sure I had a nice tight fit of the bezel into the cabinet, I decided to cut my pieces and actually glue them together inside of the cabinet itself. So the first thing I did was cut this bottom piece because it actually has to have a little bit of a bevel on the bottom since the display area is going to slope back a little bit. I also grooved all 4 pieces of the MDF using the table saw to give me a 1/4 inch deep groove. It was a little easier to use the table saw than it was to use the palm router in this particular case. But when I went to glue these together, I wanted to make sure I didn't actually get them glued to the side of the cabinet since the whole bezel was supposed to pop out. So I just simply used a couple pieces of grocery sack in there to keep any excess glue from getting on my mounting blocks or on the side of the cabinet. Once that was in place, it was simply a matter of gluing on the 2 side pieces and cutting my top piece to size. Now remember, this is not glued, but eventually I'm going to come back and these will be attached with brackets. So in this photo, you can see the completed bezel actually mounted inside of the cabinet. Again, these are my mounting blocks. So the bezel is simply screwed in to the top of these mounting blocks. And again, the angle brackets are what's holding the top on, and the bracket down here at the bottom really, again, is just a support because these are glued together. I did have to actually come back and replace these angle brackets with straight brackets just because they actually ended up getting in the way of the monitor once I started to mount the monitor. But again, here is a final copy. So if I need to replace the plexiglass, I simply remove these 4 screws on the mounting blocks. The bezel comes out of the front, remove these 2 brackets, the top comes off, and I can simply slide out and slide in a new piece of plexiglass. So with the bezel built, it was time to figure out how to mount that monitor inside the cabinet and making the monitor removable as well. I started out with just a scrap piece of I think this was craft lumber, about a 1/4 inch thick, and basically drilled holes for the VESA mount. This was attached directly to the back of the monitor, and that was going to give me a surface to put a mounting bar across that I would screw directly into the sides of the cabinet. So I used again, a piece of my 1/2 inch MDF board and a couple of brackets. So the idea again here is I would be able to remove these screws, grab this, and pull the entire monitor out of the back of the cabinet if need be. However, I ran into a problem. No matter how I tried to tighten those brackets down, I was ending up with a gap on the bottom. It just seemed that a 1/2 inch MDF was just a little bit too flexible, and the monitor, while not heavy, was heavy enough that it was causing it to not stay up flush against that bezel. So I went back and I replaced the 1/2 inch MDF with one of my 1x2 boards that I was using for basically all my furring strips. I also added a second bracket to hold that into place, and that seemed to do pretty good. But once I actually got the whole cabinet built and I'd taken the monitor back out, obviously for painting, and got it in the basement and put it back in, I was still getting a little bit of a gap. So this is the final design as of today. I actually just took this picture a little bit ago to look at the whole bezel and monitor mounting. So you can see here I've added yet another bracket to stop that from wanting to twist and bring that bottom out from the bezel. So yes, I do have a few more screws that I need to remove from each side, but if I need to replace that monitor, I can simply remove these screws from the angle bracket, grab my supporting bar, and the entire monitor will come out from the back. In a similar manner, my bezel, and again you can see where I replaced those initial angle brackets with straight brackets, but I simply remove the screws from these 4 mounting blocks and the bezel will come out of the front side, so I don't have to take the monitor out, but the bezel will come out from the front side, remove these 2 brackets, lift off the top, and replace the plexiglass. So with the bezel and monitor builds complete, it was time to move on to the marquee area, and it was going to present its own set of unique challenges. So similar to the design of the bezel, the idea was that I would be able to replace the plexiglass or even the graphics in the marquee without any disassembly. The difference here is that the 3 sides, the bottom and the 2 sides, would be permanently attached to the cabinet with glue, and initially I thought nails, but you'll see why nails weren't possible. but the top piece would really just sit in there. I could remove that top piece, remove either piece of plexiglass, because in this case, there would be two pieces of plexiglass that would sandwich the vinyl graphics that would go into the marquee area. But that would be removable, so I could replace the plexiglass or the vinyl graphics if I wanted to change the marquee. The challenge came because not only did I have to have a groove wide enough for the two pieces of plexiglass and the vinyl graphics, I also needed a groove on the front for T-molding. If you take a look at the picture here, you'll see the T-molding along the cabinet itself, but there's also T-molding. In this case, I used black as an offsetting color around the front itself. So again, I needed to have grooves on two sides of the marquee build. So again, I'm using the 1/2" MDF, and here you can see I've created the groove in the front for the T-molding. And again, I just did that with the table saw. But the tricky part then came back to create that second groove for the plexiglass. So again, I planned on nailing this, but with this set of grooves, there actually was no way to put a nail through here without going through the actual groove itself. So what I ended up doing was first just gluing on the sides and letting that dry completely, then came back, glued on the bottom piece, and then this top piece actually isn't attached to anything. It's really just cut tight, so it kind of sits in there, but it'll be held in place by the plexiglass underneath it, and of course there'll be the top panel piece that will come across. So again, if I need to replace the plexiglass or I want to change the graphics, I can simply pop this top piece off and the plexiglass and graphics will slide out of the top. So here's what it looked like after it was completely assembled. Obviously the graphics aren't in there and the plexiglass still has the protective coating on it. But again, the top piece really isn't attached to anything. It just sits there. So this top piece can be popped off and the plexiglass can be replaced or the graphics changed. And here it is with the graphics and the plexiglass in place, because I just couldn't resist putting it in there, even though I knew I was going to take it all back apart to be able to paint and finish the cabinet. And speaking of the plexiglass, I struggled because this is the first time I had ever used plexiglass in a project. So if you're like me, here are a few tips. I'm sure that the better plexiglass experienced folks know better ways. Feel free to leave comments down on this video if you do know ways. But when I started out, I was trying a bunch of different methods. I tried using the score it and snap it method. I could never get a clean break. I went through a lot of plexi and it's not necessarily cheap. So at least the best method that I came up with is I decided I needed to use a jigsaw. But of course, the plexiglass, would vibrate and it would bounce and I would have a tough time. So I actually ended up building myself a little jig that I used to cut my plexiglass. I get that plexiglass clamped down really tight with a very narrow gap, and then I could actually, with a very good jigsaw blade, I learned that right off the get-go. You need a plexiglass blade for your jigsaw. The other blades I tried to use ended up melting the plexiglass and left a whole bunch of rough edges. But with a good plexiglass blade, taking your time, I actually picked up a tip somewhere of putting a little bit of WD-40 on the blade itself just to help with cooling. I actually was able to get very precise. I don't know how well you can see it down here at the bottom. Nice clean cuts on my plexiglass. So that's going to do it for part 3. And part 4 is going to focus primarily on that control panel and the build of that, but I'll also cover some of the administrative control panel, adding marquee lighting, the speaker and audio system, the coin door, and finally a little bit about sanding and painting the cabinet. And just a quick reminder, if you're interested in even more details about my arcade, I have a blog dedicated to just the build of this arcade from the very beginning to the very end, my entire journey, with lots of more photos and lots of additional information. You can check out the link for that down in the video description. So if you've seen anything in this video that you found helpful or that you liked, do me a favor and hit that like button. That lets both me and YouTube know that you'd like to see more videos like this. And if you want to take a minute to hit that subscribe button, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you want to be notified when I release the next video in this series, ding that little bell icon. As always, I would like to say thanks for watching, and I hope to see you soon.